Excited for today's conversation. I am Daniel Getzel. Spent the past 3 years working in the federal government at the National Science Foundation's Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate, and then also spent some time at the Department of Commerce, working with the EDA team, the CHIPS team, tech hubs, and everything in between. I'm now a practitioner in residence at the Reimagining the Economy program at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm really excited about our discussion here today. We have Maria Messick and Corey Bailey, and we're going to talk about how we're unlocking data to empower economic developers, innovators, policymakers, and others. Over the past 4 years, the federal government and the Biden administration took a really creative approach to how they empowered people and put data in their hands to make economic development decisions, especially with tech-forward strategies for economic development. Previously, a lot of this work was centered around, here's a list of all the people who applied, go read through this Excel document, or here's a screenshot with some red dots on it. This is fantastic. But this past administration and the work continuing now took a much more open data approach to it, doing this in such a way where people can use the data as actual collaboration tools to team up, to layer on their own work on top of it. So we're going to hear a couple of different perspectives about how that work happened from the people who've done this on the ground, both within the federal government and in the communities across the country. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Maria Messick, who is a senior advisor to Secretary Gina Raimondo and had a number of really interesting roles within the Department of Commerce over the course of her 4 years there. Maria, take it away and feel free to demo some of the really exciting things that you all worked on during these past 4 years.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. So as Daniel mentioned, I was at the Department of Commerce for the last 4 years under the Biden administration. Through that, I got the opportunity to work on economic development programs like EDA's Build Back Better Regional Challenge, the Good Jobs Challenge, as well as the Tech Hubs program. Particularly through a seat and a new initiative that I founded in our Office of the Undersecretary of Economic Affairs called the Regional Economic Research Initiative. And I'll go a little bit further into depth on what that was in a moment. I also had the privilege of working on the CHIPS R&D program, particularly the National Semiconductor Technology Center, and thinking about the technology innovation piece as it pertains to economic development, especially as we consider locations across the country where we could really galvanize that with local communities as we were choosing sites and research centers. So I'm going to focus on the Regional Economic Research Initiative today and my role as the inaugural director and some of the tools and processes that I helped to start while I was there. And then were continued forward with other folks after I left that role. So in particular, the Regional Economic Research Initiative was really focused on, there's a lot of data out there to sift through. And I'm sure Corey can tell you that a lot of places around the country have experts, but many do not. And we wanted to figure out, what data should we be looking at as it pertains to local economies, what exists at the federal level, what are different localities looking at that they have access to, and what other federal data perhaps is not being utilized as well as it could be. And so we took the approach on, we want to, study regional economies. We want to help them better understand sort of their own strengths, especially as they think about applying to federal programs, as well as, help us learn how did, regional economies grow over time? How are they able to sort of propel themselves forward, especially with indicators that may have suggested 30 to 40 years ago that they wouldn't be where they are today. And then we wanted to build tools really to help push this forward, both for local investors, so in regions themselves, in localities, but also for federal investors. How could we learn more about, where we were spending, particularly as an agency, and how could that inform where we placed bets going forward, how we could complement specific investments we've been making over the last couple of years. And so with that focus, we actually developed specifically a tool, that we call sort of the Commerce Investment Map, which I'm excited to show a little bit about that today. So if you don't mind bringing up the slides, actually, I can go through it. If you could go to the next slide specifically. So this is sort of a snapshot of what this tool does, and it really brings together all the different investments that Commerce made in the last 4 years that could be expanded to be, later in time if one wanted to, or earlier in time. The data sources that we were using had that availability. We just wanted to focus on near term for the specific goals we were looking at the time we built this. But it helped show, we're really investing as a department across the country, but different bureaus. So bureaus like NIST, that does the CHIPS program, bureaus like EDA that focuses more on distressed regions, bureaus like NOAA that are very coastal and ocean facing. We're investing in different places. And so that also helped us paint a better picture of where a specific place was getting investments from Commerce, what those were, and how we could start to piece together what the picture of the federal investments in those communities started to look like. And so just in this tool, to give a few highlights, we had, these point level investment where we tried to figure out sort of roughly the zip code that they were located in. But we also cared a lot about the county and the state level because we wanted to focus on what is the region looking like and not just the very specific zip code that was tied to potentially the institution that was receiving the award. We were also able to show some award details here about, which bureau was funding it, what the specific program was, the amount, the date, as well as the purpose of the award, sort of the award description that's provided. And then one could toggle to things like program type. So one could look at just the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, for example, or one could focus just on economic development, which would include tech hubs, the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, and other commerce programs. And again, this was meant at first to be a tool for specifically commerce investors. And then the goal is to start building this out for either other agencies and potentially even make it available to the public. I should note, and if you don't mind going to the next slide, it can help, all of those audiences answer questions like, where are the investments clustered? What communities have tended to win investments over time? And how does the geography, as I mentioned, of grant making differ across those bureaus? And if you can click again and just go to the next slide, actually, I wanted to share a little bit about, so where is this data from? It actually draws directly from publicly available data, which I think is really important. And many people don't necessarily know about this data source. It's called usaspending.gov. Every single agency across the federal government is required to submit data to this website, but it's really big and sort of hard to parse through. And especially if you don't know the programs associated with each of the different spending categories, it can be hard to start to understand and get that picture. So that was sort of some of the layer that we added on, as well as other information directly from EDA and program names that were refined from NOAA. It focused specifically on grants and cooperative agreements in this specific tool. However, other tools, and specifically this source, had things like contracts. And then grants were also specifically looked at for primary place of performance. That is what we wanted to focus on, who's receiving the benefits of the grant and cooperative agreement rather than just the location of the institution facilitating it. That's sort of the wrap up on this specific tool. You can take down the slides now, but I think it's pretty exciting, some of the work that we did to make this a better tool, and how we were able to actually improve some of the data fidelity when making the tool, and could learn from, how we could use federal spending data to better inform our decision making going forward. Thank you. Yeah, you can take down the slides now. I'm not going to go through all of these.
All right, Monty, if you can take those down, and then we'll have Corey hop in next. While she's taking that down, Corey, do you want to just give a brief introduction on yourself?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Corey Bailey, and I am the Chief Ecosystem Officer for the Greater Baltimore Committee here in the Baltimore region. That title is about 1 month in right now. I'm the former CEO of Upsurge Baltimore, and we are decidedly not economic developers. We are ecosystem builders. So I'm going to be showing you some of the data that we've compiled around startups and startup activity. in our region and how that filters up to the greater Baltimore Committee's broader mission for economic development in the region. But I do want to caveat that this is the data that we use to inform collaboration, to inform coordination, and to really bring the ecosystem together around game-changing opportunities. And so it's been an exciting exercise for us to really, as a team, for the last 4 years, to be understanding all of the levers that impact startups and startup growth and innovation in our region, and then be able to use that data and storytelling combined to get people coordinated and collaborating around shared opportunities. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to give you guys a sneak peek first at our 2025 Tech Ecosystem Report, which will be published on Tuesday. So please don't write down the URL, don't share it broadly. You'll spoil our big reveal on Tuesday when we release this as part of our 200th Equitech Tuesday. And then I'm going to show you how some of that data filters up to GBC's scorecard, which is a mapping of all of the investments that are happening in the Baltimore region. Daniel, give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. Okay, good. So this is the sneak peek of the 2025 Baltimore Tech Ecosystem Report. This is our third of this product. And we compile third-party sources like LinkedIn, Crunchbase, PitchBook, Traction, to make sure that we have a full mapping of the startups that are operating in our ecosystem, of all the funding deals that have happened. And then what we do on a local and regional level is we try to validate that information and that data with direct source data. We go out and talk to the investors that have made investments into our region. We go out and talk to the founders that have had raises and have had exits in the region, and really try to give a more granular look at what's happening. So you can see for us, the first thing that's most important for us to impact economic growth is that everyone knows where the startups are operating in our region, what industries they're in, where our anchor sectors are, where our growth sector opportunities are. And so you can see in some of this data that there's a large concentration, obviously, of startups within Baltimore City, but pockets in other counties like Howard County, Anne Arundel County, and others. And in those geographies, there are different sectors that are thriving within them. And so the first thing that was important for us to do is map where the startups were operating in the region. Then we wanted to get a sense of what our anchor sectors are. Everyone knows in the DMV region, the quote used to be eds, meds, and feds. So you understood that 100% of healthcare policy is happening in this region. You have the top 1 to 2%, or excuse me, the top 1 or 2 research funded institutions in the world, in Johns Hopkins University and others, receiving capital for that. And number 3 in education funding. So there's a wealth of talent and research in the region. The opportunity now is, how do we take that talent and research and shift it now towards an economic model that is more grounded in commercialization, product development, and sort of executing towards economic outcomes. I'll go back and share some of the venture deal data. Baltimore has a strong background in funding in different sectors like life sciences, cybersecurity, advanced manufacturing with our port, our airport, our proximity to the federal government. And then we have some growth sectors, things like aerospace and defense, quantum, where if we can bring people together around those opportunities, we have a right to win. We have an outsized advantage on going after those type of funding opportunities. So we track those year over year. We try to do it within a 7-year time frame, and really understand what the trends are year over year in funding. I'm going to skip to the regional scorecard that we have for GBC. Now, this is a compilation of all of the investment deals. So from real estate deals into venture deals and startups, to compile sort of a higher level view of all of the investment activity that's happening in the Baltimore region. It talks about the highest level deals in real estate. You can drill down into the investments by different sectors, different activities. And so it's important for us as the unit of Upsurge Baltimore that is really managing the relationships in the startup and innovation community to filter this data as accurately as possible into the larger scope of economic activity that's happening in the region. And so, as I said, this relationship is 1 month in, but there is a proof point that we had around bringing these two very different organizations together, and that was the EDA Tech Hub opportunity. As Daniel and anyone else will tell you, Maryland has been notorious for submitting multiple grants within the same region to go after investment dollars and really leverage federal funding to increase commercialization and economic growth for the region. And for the very first time, because we were managing the relationships needed to keep everyone at the same table, and GBC had the focus of providing the data and the insights to keep everyone at the table and make the case for alignment around that Tech Hub's proposal, we were able to submit and be one of the 31 designated regions for the EDA Tech Hub's proposal. And so that was our proof point that it made sense for us to bring these two organizations together. Economic development is largely about being competitive and positioning yourself for these opportunities. Ecosystem building is about collaboration, but we believe that we can bring those two activities together and coordinate them for economic growth in the region.
Great. Thank you so much, Corey. So I'm going to just zoom us up a level, and then I'm going to walk you through some of the tools that we built at the National Science Foundation. So kind of just to paint a picture of where we were at. It was 2021. The American Rescue Plan had recently passed, and there's this $1 billion competition called the Build Back Better Regional Challenge. It was the largest ever at the time competition for regions to come together and apply to kind of put forward their strategies for how they're going to build their regional economy. And there's a ton of pent-up interest. I mean, hundreds of teams applied for this program. And then after the first round, when they reviewed all the applications and announced the short lists, they then released all the data of all the teams that had applied. And what we saw over and over again was like places like 10 miles down the road from each other were applying for the same project and in the same topic area. Corey mentioned this a little bit, but like Baltimore had 3 life sciences proposals in the region. The mayor of one of the major cities in Baltimore even signed on to write a letter of support for another county's application, not knowing his own county and city was applying. Like there was just chaos. So sitting there kind of watching this take fold, I said, is there a better model for how we can do some of this work? And our goals were kind of threefold. One, we wanted to encourage regions to come together as opposed to going at it alone. And we thought if in real time during the competition, we can share data, then they will know what other people are doing. And they can't say, well, I didn't know that, so-and-so down the street was going to apply. You did, because we published the data in real time. And then the other piece was there were a lot of organizations that weren't ready to lead an application. They were smaller community nonprofits, they were startups and others, but they really wanted to be a part of this. So we needed to help them find a way to find other organizations in a way that was frictionless. Could we be kind of a matchmaker, a collaborator, without having to say, hello, I'm going to put you on an email with so-and-so. Now you all should go work together. There's rules against that within the federal government. It's also pretty time intensive. So those are the two things that we were trying to solve for. And that kind of led us to what we ended up building at the National Science Foundation for this NSF Engines program, which I think was really creative and they're still continuing to build on. So I'm going to share my screen and kind of walk you through the process. Another thing to kind of keep in mind is all of these NSF Engines programs were launched even before the CHIPS Act passed. So we're trying to gain momentum for the CHIPS Act and get it across the finish line, while we're also showing them all this pent-up demand across the country for this funding. So part of this was to also make the case to legislators, Congress, and others. There's a massive amount of interest, and it's not just in the coast, it's not just in major cities, it is all across the country. So basically, we've received our concept outlines, which were just 2-page responses saying, I'm interested, here's what I'm thinking about. And we said, let's put it all on a map. That's been done before, but we also said is we want to let anyone to click on that map and say, I want to work with someone, I'm going to send them a quick note. And we had to do it in a way that protected everyone's identity. So we talked to some contractors and others, and they wanted to charge us hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars. And we said, can we just build this in-house? So we ended up working with Airtable, which is a venture-backed startup, and Tableau. And a very small team of us, built this in-house, which was really exciting. So we have the map. And then we also have a way for you to kind of use the data and sort through it and then reach out to teams directly. So first, you could look at it and you can say, wow, here are all these fantastic opportunities all across the country. I'm based in, let's say, Colorado. I want to click in and see what's happening in Colorado. So you could kind of click into it and see all the different projects in different parts of the state that we're thinking of applying. We have a cluster of things around Boulder and Denver. Maybe some of these teams should team up and work together. So perhaps you're working on something there and you say, oh, this is really interesting. You click on the application, learn more about it, and then you could shoot them a note. You could say, hey, I'm Maria. I'm at the University of Colorado. I saw that you're working on this. Can we team up? You can include some information on yourself. You could say where you think you could be helpful, and then send them a note. And we had to protect identities of the applicants, so we couldn't share the email addresses, but we were able to see what was happening on the back end. And we had thousands of people sending emails to each other. And the really interesting thing was, it wasn't all academics, it wasn't all economic developers. We had a lot of people from industry, venture funds saying, I didn't even know that you were working on these climate technologies in this region. This is really interesting. Can we work together? Industry partners saying, we're trying to think through this area. Could we team up with you? So we basically created this marketplace of ideas that was really, really powerful throughout this process. And then, we had other ways for you to look at it where you could, sort through it this way. You could word search, you could search by state, keywords, all these things, and then reach out to the teams that were really exciting. And I think in the first month, 40,000 people used this tool, which is like unheard of for the National Science Foundation. And we were able to take this to Congress and show them their congressional districts, how many teams were interested in this. And we had the data in a really powerful way that brought people together. And I think that's something that a lot of other agencies were excited about. I got incoming from the Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, SBA, and others saying, one, how did you get a venture-backed startup technology through procurement processes? And two, how did you build these tools online? And can we do something similar? So this was a fantastic use case. It was really, really helpful in trying to drive the collaboration we wanted to see during the application process. But then we got to the end of this process and we wanted to publish all the data. So we had the data of all the awardees and we had their regions of service. But something that I thought was really powerful was, I called this kind of like the airplane map. When you go to a flight map and you see, you can fly from here to there. I wanted to show people that money was coming from all across the country into these engines. It wasn't just them investing themselves, but because they had such great ideas, places from all across the country wanted to invest in them. So, a project in North Carolina focused on textiles was getting money from all across the country, Washington, California, elsewhere. If you looked at, what's going on in Arizona, you could also see where dollars are coming in. And this was really important to show that our dollars were catalytic. And there are other people both in the region and across the country who saw the value in this program. So I think more and more as different investors and others can share out this data so people can see who is part of your capital stack and why they care about a project, it makes it easier to make the case that, dollars are going to go very far. The federal investment is going to seed additional investments. So I'd really encourage other people at the regional level, the state level, and the federal level to think about how they can use these tools to drive collaboration and also to visualize some of these investments that are coming into these regions from all across the country. So I'll pause there and I'm going to ask a couple of questions of our speakers here, both Corey and Maria, and then we're going to open it up for questions at the end. So we're going to reserve the last 15 minutes or so for questions from the audience. So feel free to drop those in the chat as well. So I'll start with Corey. How did you use some of this federal data as you were going through this process? You had a lot of regional and local data, but how did you think about layering on some of these data sources that were coming out of the federal government during these competitions?
Yeah, and I want to thank you for sharing what you did. I really do think that this is the future of economic development, is creating awareness about the activities that are happening in a particular region so that you can align assets and most of all human capital, like the people working on these things, to leverage capital for greater impact. And I think it's interesting that data can help empower people to come together and say, you're working on that, so am I, I'm interested in that too. And then it is catalytic. It gets other people that are excited about the particular sectors, activities, or drivers of economic growth that people care about, so they can work on them together. And so for us, that is exactly what these types of data sets and sources of data helped us do. We had created a consortium of folks that were ready to work together, but not quite sure how the things that they were working on aligned. And when you have access to that kind of information that shows the connecting points of the different sectors, the different activities, the different opportunities, then that's when the creative process really starts to align around how do we then go after this capital to leverage it for greater impact. And so it was a great exercise for us to be part of, because at that point we were a startup as well, 2-year-old organization, really trying to wrap our arms around the innovation assets and startups operating in our region. And to have access to that amount of data to then support what we were learning and hearing from stakeholders, to validate those sort of anecdotal things that we were aware of, was just paramount in putting the application together, to be able to say, not only are the people saying these are gaps and opportunities, the data is supporting that these are gaps and opportunities that we can leverage this capital to go after. And, time after time, the technology will always change over time. The thing that doesn't ever change is that there will be problem sets and opportunities to go after, and there will be a set of actors and people that are ready to go after that. So data really empowers the people who are ready to go after those opportunities to do so in a way that is collaborative and not competitive.
Yeah, fantastic. And Maria, I want to turn to you next. I mean, there is no shortage of data that the federal government pumps out or has access to on a regular basis. The challenge that we see over and over again is people don't know how to use that data intelligently. You were really focused on how to productize some of that data. Can you talk to me a little bit about that process, and what were some of the products that you were focused on building?
Yeah, that's a great question, Daniel. So in particular, we tried to narrow in on who are the people, especially in the federal government. As you said, the CHIPS and Science Act had just passed. The IRA had passed prior to that, who were thinking about making really big bets around the country. And we wanted to help put the data in their fingertips to make sure that they were aware of all of the other investments or assets in the areas. So 2 specific programs sort of we focused our time and attention on and developed custom products for their decision-making process. First, the Tech Hubs program itself. I think at that point, there was a lot of think tanks who were putting out some really great pieces on, what data should we utilize to figure out what places in the country are sort of the next tech hub. We took a look at several of those methodologies and sort of distilled those down to say, okay, how do we build a tool that will allow this team to sift through different methodologies all at once, look at the data in a single place, see what the different communities or MSAs that they're looking at when they get the applications in, how they rank on that metric. And of course, they use that plus all the other information they had at their fingertips from the applications themselves. But that was one way we could sort of custom build something that they could complement what the applications they were given were able to provide them. And then we could also basically map in the way I think some of the great NSF tools that are online did. Oh, this is also, by the way, where the Build Back Better Regional Challenge has invested compared to these other data points. This is where the Good Jobs Challenge has also invested compared to these data points. We did a slightly different version of this for the Department of Energy's battery manufacturing grants. In particular, they wanted to know sort of where were the clusters of past grants they had in regions around the country. Where was this compared to other energy related EDA grants, as well as where is that compared to some of the DOE national labs that were funded by DOE. And so bringing those together helped paint a picture for them on, okay, we already see clusters in the country where we've invested in before. And should we think about doubling down? In some cases, they had done that. Or should we think about going to a new place that has some promise that we want to push forward sort of to the next stage of its innovation cycle in battery manufacturing? And so by sort of basically working hand in hand with the customer, we were able to distill down what was the problem they were trying to solve, and then use our economics team to go figure out what the data was that's available and then make some trade-offs, right? Some of the data is actually giving you the exact same indicator. For example, college grads are very different than patents, but they may also just end up in the same area because it's all around a university. So we wanted to figure out, are we double counting that signal, or do we think it's doubly strong for the next frontier of a tech hub? And that was a fun thing that we got to explore with each of these teams.
Yeah, fantastic. Corey, I'm going to go a little off the beaten path with my next question to you. I talked a little bit about this, that like a lot of times regions just wanted to put in the same application because they thought they were the big fish in that community. And they wanted to prove that they were the big fish as opposed to teaming up with others. Your organization just went through the process of a merger with Greater Baltimore Committee. It takes a lot of humility and coordination and mutual respect to kind of put egos aside and say this is better for the ecosystem to go at it together as opposed to us doing kind of duplicative things or going after the same sources of capital. How do you encourage other regions that are perhaps thinking about these similar things to think about how they can put aside the ego and really do what is in the best interest of the ecosystem?
Yeah, Daniel, that's a great question, and I appreciate it. I think it's about challenging people to think differently about ownership and really owning impact. And when you have creative thinkers in a room together, you come up with better solutions to the problem. There is not one organization or institution in any region that has all of the answers. And so if you can create a forcing mechanism to bring all of that intellectual capital, financial capital, human capital, physical capital, institutional capital into a shared space where the ideas can be shared in a safe environment, where there is low, look, we're talking about really powerful organizations. So as low ego as possible and as little judgment as possible, then you start to have a creative solution to the problem. And so I hope that it becomes more of a trend to consolidate organizations, to bring different people to the table, to align around a shared mission. You have to know your why. As long as the why is aligned, your why matches their why, and then you focus on the who should be at the table co-creating, then the what and the how kind of takes care of itself because you have all the information, you have all the energy and activity, and the people who are willing to go after that for a long period of time. And because we know that progress doesn't happen overnight. Everybody, there is no silver bullet, there is no magic wand. You have to put the work in and build the relationships, and really start to understand where impact can be created. And so I don't think it's humility more so than like the opportunity to like do something really impactful. So I would encourage organizations to not think in silos or about ownership, but about impact and how you can create infrastructure to go after that together.
Yeah, fantastic response. Really, really helpful. I'm going to ask one more or two more questions of our panelists, but please continue to drop your own questions into the chat. We're going to go to those next. So this one's for Maria. You all ran out of time at the end of the administration. There were still things you wanted to build. There are still things that, you were hoping to pursue. What were some of the things that you're like, there is a lot of really interesting momentum or data behind this. I hope the new administration continues this work and uses it to inform their investment decisions, as opposed to, going out in a more ad hoc approach. Can you talk about some of the things that, like, if you all had some more time, you wish you had kind of had the opportunity to continue to build out and explore?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Daniel. In particular, I think back to some of the key technology areas that were outlined in the CHIPS and Science Act by Congress. And those are awesome, like industries of the future, essentially, that I think most people can agree very much in a bipartisan way. We should be rallying around to build a stronger foundation for and to grow in our country. What I would have really loved to do is analyze the federal investments programs, past investments by those categories to figure out, which agencies were really pushing them forward, who had strengths in that area, where in the country the concentration of those investments are, in particular, which institutions were particularly good at them because they were getting those federal investments, and then figure out what was missing from that. Was it all focused on R&D? Was there more on the commercial side? Was it business tax credits? Or were one of those pieces of the puzzle missing? And how should the federal government, whether it was one of those specific agencies that was very forward-leaning on that key technology area, or the overall institution, help sort of fill in that gap and encourage that progress forward? And I think it's really important to think about it from the technology vertical rather than the program side, because I think you can get lost in your silos very quickly from the program and agency component, and it's better to put the picture together at sort of the macro industry level.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. Most people don't know the names of these individual programs, especially people coming out of this from a private sector. They want to know, how is the federal government investing in quantum, or what do its AI investments look like? And oh, interesting, they're not all in San Francisco and Cambridge, Massachusetts, where there's some under the radar opportunities. And I know, we worked together on a project looking both at like federal investments, SBIR investments, and some venture capital investments in semiconductors to see if there are kind of these under the radar nodes across the country that were getting above their kind of per capita rate investment into semiconductor technologies coming out of that place. And not just looking at venture capital investment across the board, but going more particularly deeper in the level of like, here's a sub area where this place has a particular strength. And Corey, I know you all talked a little bit about this, and when you were digging into this, healthcare was an obvious sector that came to the fold as here's a differentiated strength. Did you all at any point kind of start to go a little bit deeper? I mean, healthcare is a massive space. There's a lot of subsegments with that. How do you think about like your differentiated advantage within some of these larger verticals that Maria and I just talked about?
Yeah, it's another great question. And it starts with knowing who the people are in those subsectors. So you've got, obviously life sciences, biotech, and the technologies and science that is being translated out of our universities. You've got like medical device and then digital health and some of the different applications that can help streamline processes and help with patient care delivery. And so it's an interesting like puzzle to put together, right? When you're thinking about healthcare as an industry broadly, and all of the different subcomponents that impact either healthcare policy, delivery, or patient care. And it really just comes down to understanding where those different nodes of activity are happening, who some of the leaders are in that, and how they're consolidating opportunities for investment and sort of translation from technology and science into commercial products. And I think Maria kind of hinted to this, right? Like there has been an enormous federal investment in research into Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, and into our region for 30 years plus. And we have not had the foundation of translating that research into commercial products. We're about 7-8 years into sort of understanding, if we want to be engaged in the industries of the future, we have to be creating commercial products, services, and businesses oriented around this technology, this science. And so it's a healthy exercise to continue that learning loop, continue having those conversations, seeing who's engaged, putting pilots and models in place to go out and see if we can't increase activity and investment into those and generate more startup activity. I envision a time where, and this is the moment for it. I might say it might be the moment for it when we're seeing such transition of priorities in the federal government, and it will change 4 years from now, 8 years from now. It's always on that cycle. We really do need to set a foundation of commercial readiness and economic growth that is grounded in translating that science and technology into jobs and economic growth. So you just have to do the work to drill down into those subsectors and know exactly where those opportunities and the assets that exist in your region are, that you can connect to other regions as well for that growth.
Great. I'm going to start feeding in some questions that I'm seeing coming in from the audience, and then I'll ask some of my own. This one is to Corey. Can you share a little bit of how Upsurge initially got off the ground and got funded? What was the gap that you were filling, and what was more opportunistic?
Yeah, great question. So we launched almost 4 years to the date in May of 2021. Leaders from some of our anchor institutions and major corporations like Johns Hopkins, Brown Advisory, Pointfield Partners, which is the family office of Steve Bisciotti. Steve Bisciotti is the owner of the Baltimore Ravens, were some of our initial foundational funders around the work that we're doing. And we came together sort of as a opportunity for direct investment into a sort of startup business attraction strategy. We brought Techstars into the region. We ran the first corporate Techstars accelerator in Baltimore called Techstars Equitech. We had 3 phenomenal classes of startups that were either homegrown or joined us in the region. And now that relationship lives with some of our anchor healthcare partners in CareFirst, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and Johns Hopkins University. The other component of what we did launching is what we sort of focus on now, which is that ecosystem building. Getting people out of the silos, bringing them to the table together, and starting to create complex solutions to the gaps and problems that we're seeing. And those problems could, they are at a different stage, but persist. It is aligned financial capital at each stage of growth for startups, and in particular by industry or sector. It is corporate engagement. How do we get corporate innovation elevating the problems that they want startup communities and startups to be solving, and then engage with them in a way that accelerates that startup growth. And then it's data. It really is data. How do we leverage data to support the products, the programs, the solutions that we use, and then bring people into those programs in ways that are best aligned with their capabilities, their talents, to create more startups, more startup growth in the region. So and we've iterated that year over year. We've had to, because the gaps and the opportunities shift year over year. We've had to create an organization that can be both proactive and responsive to the different things happening in our region. And so it's been a learning process year over year. And we have naturally gone from a community organization to a citywide organization to a regional organization, now sort of at the economic development level. And it just makes sense at the moment that we're at that we bring those capabilities and activities to the economic development engine.
Great. This next one is to Maria. So on a regular basis, different regions that are called economic development districts need to put together kind of comprehensive strategies. How were some of the tools that you're building, could they potentially be helpful to these regions as they build their next set of comprehensive strategies? These are required to unlock funds from the Economic Development Administration, and they're also required to help the regions start to think and refresh their strategies on a regular basis. Any ideas about how some of the work that you were doing could be passed over to these EDDs?
Yeah, and I think maybe it would be taking some of this data that is available on USA spending on federal investments that is located in the relevant EDD for a specific place, and figuring out how to put that in your strategy going forward, right? Talking about the history, whether it's the last 5 years, last 10, 15 years, on why the federal government has been investing and what specific industries or activities it's been investing in, and where the region wants to position itself for future federal investments or private sector investments as well, and how those can be built upon what foundation already exists. I think would be a super powerful way EDDs could leverage that. And it would be great, obviously, if some of these tools became more public, but luckily the data source already is. And so that's still widely available for folks to use.
Yeah, and I think that's really powerful, and it's very different than how some of these other competitions are run. So like when a large company is thinking about where they're going to relocate, let's use Amazon HQ2. They suck up all this data from all these regions across the country, and then they make a decision on 1 or 2 places, where they negotiate the largest possible deal. And obviously that 1 or 2 places, that's fantastic for them. They're having new jobs, they're having new investment. But a lot of places just put a ton of effort and dollars into this, and they don't really have a lot to get in return. Amazon now has all the data on their college graduates. They have the data on, their investments, and they can use that information to think about hiring, thinking about data centers, thinking about supply chains. Is there a way for the federal government, as it ingests similar levels of data from these regions, to kind of open source it back to the public, as opposed to kind of use it in a proprietary manner in the way that an Amazon or a Tesla or someone else might be? This isn't to pick on Amazon or Tesla, like this is how you build your business models, but I would love to think about how the federal government could take advantage of some of those similar things in a way to build tools that kind of show high ROI on the taxpayer investment.
Yeah, I would frankly love to see that too. I think that kind of tool needs to sit in like a more central function. Could be at GSA, which would be a great spot for it, or OMB.
Can
Treasury
you just
is.
share out what those abbreviations are?
Oh, yeah. Office of Management and Budget and General Services Administration. As I was about to say, I think Treasury is the entity that puts out USA spending, but maybe I'll take a step back. There are fantastic statistical agencies across the federal government, like the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the two being at Commerce, but there are others like the Bureau of Labor Statistic at the Labor Department, and NSF has its own amazing statistical agency as well. Those are really focused on building these very useful statistical data sets that then others can cobble together for various purposes. And those agencies don't want to do that because they want the users to decide how to use the data to their best ability. But I think if one of these centralized agencies was able to ingest that data in a way to show specific regional characteristics all in one place, it could be very valuable for communities across the country. Again, so the communities don't have to necessarily each do this themselves. It could be one tool. That's a lot of data. So, it might need to be specific to regions depending on what you want the interface to look like. But I think it's totally possible, and I'd love to see something like that in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And folks, we still have about 10 minutes. So if you have additional questions, drop them into the chat. And we'll make sure we have time to answer those. But this next one is to Corey. I would love to learn a little bit more about like your qualitative follow-up with startups. Once you got the information about their funding rounds and others from PitchBook or whatever it would be, what did you do? Were you just validating that information, or how did you use that intelligence in a way that put it to public good?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yeah, it's one thing to validate third-party source data. It's another thing to say, like, what next? Like, what is actionable from that? And so the answer is kind of TBD right now. We have traditionally tried to pilot programs that address the need for startups to get the two things that they want the most, right? Which is customers and capital to continue to grow. The customer piece is so vital. How do we bring industry to startups so that they can do customer discovery, find product market fit, and really then accelerate their growth through revenue? The other part is, like, when you're in that period of growth, sometimes you need aligned and aligned valued and aligned capital to continue that trajectory to become a profitable and business for all of the investors and stakeholders. So what we are endeavoring to do, what we have done as a team, is try to provide some of that next step connectivity and network capital to bring the right people into the rooms to help accelerate that growth. What we want to do now is create a data engine that supports that sort of corporate engagement engine to really support how we validate the companies that are at the right stages, that need the right interventions, and that would really benefit from strategic opportunities for engagement with our private sector. And so that's what we're trying to build, is sort of a real-time intelligence of the startups active in our ecosystem, connected to the right sources, resources and assets and human capital to be able to accelerate their growth. The one thing I want to say is I think important to what Maria was mentioning. There is more capital in the private sector than in government, and so we're at an opportunity place where people like Maria, people like Daniel, that have come out of some of these federal institutions and have the knowledge to help build some of these tools and apply them to ROI for the private sector. To really accelerate that growth. And I know that we're talking about like leveraged capital from the federal government, but I think there's an opportunity to really turn the page or the mirror back around to the private sector and say, what are we going to do to accelerate growth and create more economic opportunity and ROI for the future of this country? So I just want to say that, like, the work that you guys are doing is important. It doesn't just have to live with the federal government, and that we need to create opportunities for that knowledge to be transferred in a way that can accelerate investment from the private sector as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a fantastic point. And the last question I'm going to wrap up with, I'm not going to come into yet, but I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about it, is like, what do you wish existed in the universe right now from a data perspective that doesn't exist, and who could build it? So that's going to be kind of our final wrap-up question. But before that, I'm going to put a question to Maria that just came through in the chat. You all mentioned Amazon. How do you work with other cloud service providers to share more public data in their respective marketplaces, whether that's Google, Microsoft, Snowflake? Is that something that's on your radar or was on your radar?
Oh, that's a great question. It's not something that I focused on when I was in the Department of Commerce on how they might share back data. As Daniel mentioned, like they've ingested a lot of this public data on places that they've been able to scoop up. And yes, they've just essentially used it for their internal decision-making processes. I guess my point is like that information does exist publicly. Someone should perhaps be stitching it together and providing it as whether it's a public service or perhaps a paid service, as Corey mentioned. And I think there's a real opportunity to do that. And I'm sure one of these cloud providers would be happy and willing to host it. And so I'll just put this challenge into the universe. Perhaps Amazon or someone else could start publishing that data in a useful way. But I think, also private entities like PitchBook, I think has been mentioned a few times. That's a really powerful data source that would also be great to have more publicly available, especially for communities around the country thinking about their startup ecosystems.
Yeah, absolutely. So, that's kind of you putting it out into the universe. Here's the thing that I'll put out in the universe and hope someone captures. I think we have a ton of data that individual universities put out where they say, oh, we have students from all 50 states and 15 countries. They never say how many students they have from those different places, what are those countries. So I would love to see someone create basically what we created with like those airplane maps for how students flow around the country, undergrad, PhD, and the like. Where are they coming from? Look at this community college level as well. It doesn't just have to be 4-year college degrees. Where do they go afterwards, both in terms of, do they stay in the region? Are they still based in Baltimore? Or did they move out to San Francisco or New York? And what does that look like depending on their major? Are we seeing certain majors where they're now seeing agglomeration in different parts of the country? I would love to see kind of these maps to show what that looks like after some of these really large place-based investments, what that looks like before and after certain immigration decisions. I think all of these things could be really interesting ways to think about how we flow intellectual capital across our nation. So I would love to see universities, funding organizations, the National Science Foundation, and others to kind of team up to open source that data and break it out of the silos of individual universities and community colleges. Corey, what's your wish list? What do you want to put out to the universe in terms of a data product or a visualization tool or a new approach that you don't think exists just yet?
Yeah. I just looked this stat up to confirm that I was not lucid when I learned about it. Between Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, and Apple, they spent over $175 billion in R&D in 2022. That means they're investing in what's next, what they need, capabilities they need to have. And there's over 370 AI unicorns right now. That means there's 370 plus billion-dollar valuation companies on a capability that's not really yet an industry. So that's sobering for me, but it's also an opportunity, I think. And if I were to envision or dream up the data set that would be a game changer, I don't know, it would be sort of a AI model that compiles all of the data to support the fact that capital that goes to the most underestimated groups in our country yield a better return on investment for the entire region that they're in, and then starts to put together capital to support the growth of those individuals, organizations, collaborators, consortiums that come together to do that for the greater good.
Yeah.
Can I build off of that, Corey,
Yeah,
actually, and say like a wish list item of mine is basically an asset map for the country. Like, I think when you're in a local community, you know what those assets are if you've been familiar with the place for long enough. It's in a lot of people's heads. It's really hard when you're coming from outside the region, whether you're an investor, a student, a job seeker, to figure out those exact pieces of the puzzle and also how they work together. Almost, Daniel, in a different way. I love the map, the sort of flight map that you've talked about, but for a specific local community, what are those key assets? And then what are the connectors on how they're working together? And then potentially how they work with other institutions across the country as well. I think that'd be super valuable. And I think it's hard, right? It's not like a traditional data set where you're measuring specific changes over time, but it's tied to location in a real way. Some of those other pieces aren't necessarily.
Those are both fantastic ideas. And I hope that people who are watching this are saying, yeah, I want to get started on that. How do we build that together? Because I think there could be a lot of momentum across sectors for both of those ideas that you all just laid out there. So, I mean, this has been a fantastic discussion. I really like how we're coming at this from different perspectives. You know, Corey is talking to us about what he's seeing on the ground in these different regions and how he actually saw these data products coming out of the federal government and what worked for them, what didn't work as well. You know, and then Maria and I are both giving kind of different perspectives about how different agencies tackle this. But really, I mean, as we've kind of tried to talk about in great detail here, we weren't just building products for ourselves. You know, at NSF, we teamed up with the Department of Commerce to map our investments on top of each other. You know, Maria talked about how the Department of Energy was using things that you all were building. And I think the ability to get more agencies bought in and developing these tools together, as opposed to thinking about how they put it up on their own page and how they can, you know, promote it in their own press release, is an important evolution of our government. And now with the, you know, the advent of all these new AI technologies, the way for people to glean information from that in a valuable way is much more powerful than it's ever been before. So, you know, I really appreciate everyone joining us today. I appreciate the people who are tuning in and listening to this discussion, and hope that we can continue this conversation about how we can use data for good and empower economic developers and investors to take advantage of these unbelievable regional assets all across our country. So thank you so much, Maria. Thank you, Corey. And I hope everyone has a fantastic day.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
Thanks all.